The betrayal came not with a scream or a public confrontation, but simply with the terrible, heavy silence of a suffocated brotherhood. It was the slamming of a door in a room where two men had once shared everything: hunger, dreams, and a revolutionary frequency that the rest of the world was just beginning to hear. In the mid-1970s, the deep brotherhood between Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer had been severed by what they had fought to build. Success had acted like acid, breaking their brotherhood, leaving behind two men who looked at each other and no longer recognized each other. While Bob leaned on the machinery of global stardom, Bunny retreated into the isolation of the mountains, a faith that demanded purity more than popularity. The distance was not just physical, it was ideological, a gulf between the man who wanted to save the world and the man who wanted to save his soul. This particular moment of separation was not an argument, but a quiet, mutual understanding that their paths were now parallel lines and would never cross again. Bob, as if he had a premonition that his time was a limited currency, moved at a speed that blurred faces and scorched the earth. Meanwhile, Bunny moved with the deliberate, slow gait of a man who believed that to touch the world was to be stained by it. This was not a disagreement over publishing rights or tour schedules. This was a fundamental separation of the soul. The tension in the air during their final encounters was thick enough to choke on, a stagnant pressure that signaled the end of an era. There were no grand gestures of farewell. Instead, there was a steady withdrawal, a pulling back of the hands until the space between them became an unbridgeable canyon. This silence would eventually become the loudest thing in both of their lives. Every time Bob reached out, he found only a shadow. Every time Bunny looked at the tough gong, he saw a monument to a man he no longer knew. The silence between them grew until it became its own entity, a third person in every room they occupied. It was a silence born of exhaustion, the kind that follows a war where both sides have lost. Bob's world became a whirlwind of private jets and stadium lights, a life lived in the glare of 1,000 lenses. Bunny's world became the soil and the silence of the country, a life lived in the shadows of the trees. They were like two celestial bodies that had once collided to create a sun, now spinning away into the darkness of their own orbits. The friction of their departure left a heat that lingered for years, a reminder of what happens when the brother you chose becomes the stranger you fear. This shift in gravity ensured that they would never share a stage again. As the years wore on, the letters stopped, the phone calls ceased, and the mutual friends began to pick sides in a war that was never officially declared. It was a cold war of the heart, fought with absence and omission. Stories like this are rarely told in full. That's why Marley Files exists. When the news of the diagnosis finally reached the hills, there was no rush to the bedside, no cinematic reunion in a sterile hospital room. The distance had become a physical weight, a barrier that even the specter of death could not dismantle. Bob lay in the grip of a wasting disease, his body a frail cage for a spirit that had conquered the globe, while Bunny remained anchored to his convictions, a sentinel of a world Bob had left behind. There is a specific kind of cruelty in a long, slow goodbye, where the memories of shared poverty and shared purpose are slowly overwritten by the reality of resentment. They had survived the gutters of Trenchtown together. They had faced down the gunmen together, but they could not survive each other's growth. The transformation of Robert Nesta Marley into a global icon was, for Bunny, a personal loss that felt like a desecration. He saw the compromise where the world saw greatness. This fundamental disagreement on the price of fame would haunt their final years. Conversely, Bob saw Bunny's withdrawal as a desertion, a refusal to carry the weight of the message when the burden was at its heaviest. This was the core of the rot, the belief that the other had
was not a
failed
lack
a
of
sacred
words,
trust, but a surplus of things that could no longer be said. To speak would have been to admit that the dream was dead, and neither man was willing to be the one to pronounce the time of death. Instead, they let the relationship bleed out in the dark. There were moments, brief flickers of reports from common acquaintances, where a name would be mentioned and a face would tighten, a flicker of the old fire visible for just a second before the mask of indifference was pulled back into place. They had become myths to each other, statues of the boys they used to be, frozen in a time before the world intervened. The inevitability of their separation felt like a law of physics. The more Bob expanded, the more Bunny had to contract to maintain the balance of his own sanity. This imbalance made any future reconciliation a technical impossibility. By the time the end was near, the bridge had been burned so thoroughly that there wasn't even ash left to scatter. The finality of it was absolute, a jagged line drawn through the middle of a legacy that belonged to both of them but could be claimed by neither. Even as the world mourned the passing of a legend, a small part of that legend remained buried in the silence of a man who refused to weep for a ghost. The resentment had calcified into a quiet, permanent fixture of their lives, as immovable as the mountains. There was no room for forgiveness, because forgiveness requires an admission of wrong, and both men believed they were the only ones who had stayed true to the path. In the end, the brother Bob chose to lose, was the only person who truly knew the man behind the image, and that was the very reason he had to be let go. This decision transformed a brotherhood into a historical footnote. The intimacy of their past was too painful to carry into the future Bob was building. The separation was the price of the crown. It remains a heavy, unresolved chapter in a story that the world prefers to see as a triumph. But in the quiet corners of the history, where the music fades and the lights go down, the absence of Bunny at the finish line is a hollow thud that echoes through the years. It is a reminder that some wounds are too deep to heal, and some silences are too loud to ignore. The two men who once sang in perfect harmony ended their lives in a profound, dissonant isolation. There was no final handshake, no whispered reconciliation, no closing of the circle. There was only the cold, hard fact of two separate lives, lived in the shadow of a shared history that neither could escape and neither could return to. The story doesn't end with a sunset or a song. It ends with the realization that even the strongest bonds can be worn away by the slow, grinding movement of time and ego. It is a story of what is left behind when the fire goes out, not just ash, but the cold, unyielding stone of a relationship that died long before the men did. The silence remains the only honest thing left between them. A vast, empty space where a brotherhood used to live. It is a reflection of the cost of greatness, a quiet testament to the things we discard in order to become what the world demands us to be. The legacy is intact, the music is eternal, but the human cost is a debt that was never paid, a ledger that remains open and bleeding in the dark.